Welcome. You're in out of the rain, so things could be worse. My name is Kevin Abbott. I'm the Dean of the School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution, and there is a book. I wanted to show it to you. That's the title, but there's a physical book. There are a few things that are more fun for me to do, to have done over the years, than to launch a book. Because launching a book is a little bit like attending a birth ritual, which is always a nice thing. Some of the books of our colleagues, some of them are by alumni, some of them are by students, and they all have their own joy, their own specialness. So Dan and then Rich will talk about the book, but I do want to say a few words about why I think it is really special and a real contribution. It is about the power of states to injure people, to cause hurt, by in some sense getting inside their heads and deforming their social selves. So, you know, we all know about how states can hurt people simply with rubber truncheons, and that's direct violence. And we know how states or powers can hurt people through ideologies that justify the hurt, and that's cultural violence, a kind of system of symbols and ideologies which make it make sense to cause certain kinds of violence to people. But Dan is really carving out a new sense of kinds of violence from Johan Galton's classic structural and cultural, and that is the violence that he calls either existential violence or systemic violence, the violence that happens when a state can focus its, in many ways, non-material power, something other than the rubber truncheon, on minorities, on vulnerable populations, and to do so, of course, by, as I said, getting inside their heads and deforming their social selves. Now, it's a little more complicated because people are agents, and they can fight back in various ways. And one of the other interesting things about the book is Dan talks about the ways in which people can resist this sort of violence, because resistance is in fact not futile, although it's always costly in some ways. And at the end of the book, he talks about ways in which we as a peace-building community can harness something about compassion. So we're talking about the power to humiliate, and the flip side of that is the importance of dignity. Sometimes in other lists of human needs, it's called recognition, which is kind of a close cousin to dignity. One of the things that I was struck at the Arab Spring and the events surrounding it and the events following it is if you looked at the placards that were being held in Tahrir Square, among other places, there were some that were in English, and they were for CNN and for BBC mostly, and they focused on words like democracy. And it wasn't that democracy wasn't important, but democracy appeared on the placards in English. But in Arabic, there were other words, karama, which is one of the ways of saying dignity in Arabic. There are ways of talking about honor and pride and so forth. But most of the signs in Arabic talked about dignity. That's what was missing. Democracy is important, and when democracy works, it's a way towards dignity, because any democracy that doesn't contain protections for minorities, however defined, is not a real democracy. And unfortunately, we're all learning about that here and in Europe. So democracy is one way to dignity, but talking about dignity straight out is really to get at the nub of what these revolutions and revolts were about. Because you may recall it began in Tunisia with a young seller illegally selling fruit being slapped across the face. Not just being arrested, but being slapped across the face. Now, the fact that he was slapped across the face by a female police officer complicates things, and that brings in gender, but let's focus on being slapped across the face. And that was for him the last straw. And then, as you know, he immolated himself and everything else followed. So this is a book about dignity. It is a book about, I think, one of the basic human needs, whether you call it dignity or recognition. I think it is a book that opens up new ways of thinking about violence. And at the end, I think it's a book about having us understand how we can reflect and react to that by harnessing something he calls compassion. So I'm anxious to hear more of what you have to say, if I haven't said it all. And Dan, congratulations. It is really a very fun book and an important contribution to our field. And it's short. You know, short is really important. Short books get read. Dan.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dean Averick. I am obviously so grateful to Dean Averick for basically doing two things. Basically, consistent with this university saying, you got to do research, but also encouraging, promoting, being very generous in supporting in many different ways and being an inspiration, obviously, from his own research. So my name is on the book cover, but and I'm very overwhelmed that that you're here to celebrate, but this is really a celebration for SCAR. The reason is that over the past few years, I actually kind of like took a lot of ideas that I heard from my colleagues. I tried to footnote everything and basically processed them. I received great assistance from my graduate assistants. Emily Sample is here, I think I saw. Hi, Emily. Sandra Tombe, Adib Yusuf, Kuldeep Nirula, and Nina Lay. This is also a great joy to have that. So in a way, I'd like to say that you're honoring SCAR as it should be, and also expecting us to keep producing. And I feel like, well, this came out last month. What am I doing in May? Okay. So that's a question. But also this book was inspired actually by what I perceive as a major disconnect between the academic work and the way people think about their lives. Everybody, of the few people who I've spoken with who are immersed in conflict, who are subjected to state oppression, invariably they say something like, why don't they treat me like a human being? Why do they treat me like an animal? Why don't they just leave me? So there was clearly an emotion, but it was also a sense of their political status, their human status. And this deep sense of what I would call a kind of an existential violence, as Dean Averick mentioned, I think has been missed by academics, especially the theories. They've been kind of dancing around it, but not given the importance that it deserves. So, to start. Jinghe Temple is a temple of tranquil sea in Nanjing, China. This temple contains a museum that showcases a century of humiliation. That the temple has on display many artifacts over the years, between those years, of foreigners conquering large portions of China. And basically the primary narrative is disgrace, humiliation, and shame, which of course, not surprisingly, is invoked by every Chinese leader I think everyone, or certainly most of them, especially in the prelude to war. This picture basically depicts, it's hard to see, the Russian bear. This is China, the Russian bear, US eagle, and so on. This was a picture that was presented in 1900, which is on display as a symbol of foreign invasion. So here we have national humiliation. Another context, France and Germany have gone through cycles of national humiliation, well known, obviously, the French humiliation in the Franco-Prussian War, German humiliation after World War I, obviously Versailles, and of course the catastrophe, which is not an appropriate word, I don't know what word to say, of World War II. In the US context, the global war on terrorism, that is the attacks on 9/11, basically is the 21st century national humiliation. And what happens oftentimes with national humiliation with high power groups is a prelude to war, obviously, as we continue to experience. So that's national humiliation, disgrace from foreign invaders. But what happens when the state itself becomes an instrument of manufactured humiliation? What happens when the state basically takes on a campaign of reimagining the nation in a way that defines a marginalized group as inferior? This is basically the theme of systemic humiliation, state-sponsored, systemic, because it involves basically patterns of practices in very specific fields of governmentality, very specific fields of governmentality, that promotes an inferiority of a targeted group. The mechanisms are well known. Insults, stigmatization, contortion of the self. We have, and in doing that, there is always the, as it were, the opposite glorification of the high power group. That is, the mechanism of stigmatization involves necessarily or invariably self-glorification, kind of a narcissistic, a state-sponsored kind of narcissism of the pure group. Then there are at least 3 kinds of strategies that can be identified for this. These are very large scale, so I'm skipping over a lot of the details, but you know the strategies of state directives, that is laws. So you know about the laws of Nazi Germany, the Reich Citizenship Law, South Africa, the Group Areas Act law, where the South Africans were required to live in 4 areas based on racial designation. Canada's law about the members of the First Nations being restricted location, and of course the Jim Crow laws of the US South. There is, in contemporary time, there's currently a strategy, a state-sponsored strategy involving immigrants. This strategy is being deployed in certain states, not also at the national level, but also at the state level, which is identified as forced attrition. You know what attrition is. It's a campaign of war in which basically the enemy, the conditions of survival of the enemy become so eroded that they are compelled, as it were, to stop fighting. Forced attrition or attrition has been designated by certain state legislators as a necessary mechanism to induce immigrants to voluntarily self-deport. And this comes in the form, as you know, of workplace raids. Landlords are being fined for renting apartments to, this is unauthorized immigrants, but I'm sure some of the practices are also carried out even to authorized immigrants. Access to critical social service is threatened. So in this case, we have a state policy of strategic humiliation and fear. So that's one strategy. So another strategy, very different kind of mechanism, is categorical erasure. And this strategy basically occurs or consists of contortion of the targeted group of their sense of self. That is, to take on a sense of their inferiority, inaccessibility, and so on. This, by the way, is a major theme of scholars and activists on race and conflict in the US, the theme of Erasure Invisibility. Frantz Fanon, I think, is brilliant on this, probably the most insightful on this, but many others have identified this. In a sense, what that involves is to deauthenticate the group. That is to say that you are not authentic in a certain way as a member of the country, authentic maybe even as a human being in some cases, in extreme cases, and it fosters their invisibility. So in this categorical erasure, you know the mechanisms now are somewhat familiar. Basically, suppressing group suffering in history textbooks. So history education then becomes a setting for erasure of suffering of certain groups, destroying cemeteries, homes, sites of ritual, which is very interesting, by the way. In Eastern Europe, after the fall of the Soviet Union, many ethnic groups who were oppressed or basically subject to genocide, in effect, have gone back to revisualize, if that's a word, their presence, their historic presence, by showcasing their cemeteries. And I saw this directly in Poland in around 2000, where this was a major push by Jews in that area. Another form of erasure is simply removing their names from official records. And this was commonly in practice with Native Americans in the United States, obviously. And a very interesting case of this is with the recurrence or the recognition of a particular group, the Monacan Indian Nation in particular, which was very prominent in Virginia, but their name in effect was erased. That is, they were not recognized by the state of Virginia until 1989. And so there was a campaign to overcome, obviously, the erasure, and they did receive recognition at that point. So a third kind of strategy is something that's very well known, I think, in conflict analysis and resolution, motivated, obviously, by, I think, the brilliant work of Pierre Bourdieu, who talks about symbolic violence. So this is a case where government can recategorize a nation. So if you think of a nation as an imagined community, governments are, in this pattern, engaged in manufactured reimagination in a way that divides the nation into categories of pure, impure, legal, criminal, and so on. So on this list of, as it were, the high power group, there's a number of narratives that are often repeated. Sometimes they're original people, the people who were, as it were, the base people in Cambodia. This was prominent Cambodia as opposed to the new people, authentic or adorned by God. And notice with these features, they become essential, and the impure category becomes removable. So the logic of the action is entwined. In other words, once a category of people becomes inessential, it is very easy to rationalize their expulsion. So in this, there's a couple of cases. Certainly, the case have a chapter in the book on Sudan. Sudan basically has orchestrated for, at least since the time of Omar Bashir, who is probably living very comfortably in a five-star hotel somewhere. I don't know that for a fact, but it's probable. The future of Sudan, I think, is extremely precarious. But for decades, Sudan basically perpetuated a campaign of purification of the authentic Sudanese person. And that would be a person who complies with Sharia law, who conforms to political Islam, and who uses Arabic, the Arabic culture, as basically a sense of political superiority at the expense of indigenous groups, in particular Darfur. So the Darfur Genocide, by the way, that reached its peak in the early 2000s was definitely a result of this campaign of impuritizing, that is, to identify certain groups as inauthentic Sudanese, and therefore, of course, dangerous, subject to all forms of danger on this. Another example of this campaign is in the United States. We all know now the political rhetoric. What's interesting about the rhetoric on immigration in the United States is that some of the language that's used by politicians is carried over to the police authorities, to ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that their language, that they, Immigration and Customs Enforcement is basically rationalizing their work as protecting the nation. That is, it's not, it could be rationalized in other ways, but it is a national security commitment. And some of the terminology is very similar to the rhetoric that we hear by politicians. So what we have here is a number of themes that basically flesh out the notion of systemic humiliation, that the state is, that power is ever present in the state. The state has the capacity to distort the sense of self of targeted groups. That distortion can be debasement, degradation, dehumanization, and that it is often rationalized as essential for the well-being. In particular, the narratives of security, securitization, are very commonly used to rationalize these forms of systemic humiliation. Now, part of my kind of transition here, one of the motivations for engaging in this project is some of the groundbreaking work in experimental psychology. Our field, by the way, is proud to recognize the whole person as essential for understanding conflicts. Frankly, I think we've done a very bad job, we conflict analysts, of keeping up with some of the current findings in experimental psychology. One area of which is the neuroscience field. And the neurosciences have basically identified the kind of pain that is experienced by humiliation. So the question is, how does this humiliation affect people? And a part of the answer is that it is experienced as pain. This diagram shows that the neural processing activity in the anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula is activated by two kinds of experience. One, physical pain, that's been known for some time, and also social psychic pain. That the social psychic pain of exclusion, of humiliation, activates these two neural processors in the way in which physical pain is activated. So it is a scientifically recognized kind of pain, at least in the neuroscience. Let me give you an example of this. What I want to add to this is that this form of humiliation is also political. We need a new category, and I don't have a really great word for this, to totally blend psychic pain with political pain. That these are not separate processes, these are conjoined. And I want to just give you an example of this. And what's noticeable about this is an encounter of two women at a grocery store at Trader Joe. And it goes for 1 minute. And notice how calm and seemingly matter-of-fact this event is.
So you play dumb, and then you say that everybody's great. Okay. I got it. Shouldn't have let you in front of me. Don't worry. Sorry. I wish I didn't let you in the country. Excuse me? Huh? I was born here. I don't know if you... Oh, you were? Okay. Obama's not in office anymore. We don't have a Muslim in there anymore.
Yeah, I wish he was.
He's gone. He's gone.
Yeah.
He may be in jail, too, in the future.
You look a little crazy. Maybe you need to get some help.
Oh, I'm fine.
No, you're not. Because you don't just strike up a conversation with people in line talking about stuff like that if you're normal.
I'm very normal.
Yeah, it looks like it. I can tell.
What set you off, Obama?
So what's striking to me about that, did you hear that? You heard, you did hear it? You heard it? I heard it? Okay. What's striking is how just matter-of-fact it was. It was as if it was embedded in the normal conversation of that woman with blonde hair. The other woman was wearing a hijab, and I didn't get her appearance, but I suppose she appeared to be Muslim. That was the theme here. Very matter-of-fact, very much a sense of entitlement. Notice the stance, the kind of comfortable tone, as if she said this before, I don't know for sure. But this is a political, a psychic and political humiliation, which happens, unfortunately, too often in our society. A kind of existential violence, which basically goes to the core of someone's sense of self. It's not a mundane form of feeling that passes in a short time, not like just hitting your hand on the table. It endures over time. So let me just say just very short statement about the book's ending. As Dean Averitt mentioned, I kind of got really tired of looking at all of these rather violent kind of episodes and thinking, well, if humiliation can be systematized, can compassion also be? And I think it can be in governments, though I didn't write about that, but it's certainly systematized, that is a mode of practice in conflict resolution. And I'm very grateful to my colleague, Professor Susan Allen, who basically steered me off false paths and led me to find some excellent examples and cases of this pattern. So systemic compassion basically is a mode of practice where compassion is a defining, as it were, principle. Compassion, a norm in which you are committed to understanding suffering of the other and hoping for the relief of their suffering. And this is basically probing the similarities between us and them. That is, in conflict resolution, there are many, many practices where the conflict transformation basically seeks to promote what we're calling systemic compassion in different ways. And part of the motivation for this is also the neuroscience, which has identified compassion as a certain function in the brain, which is depicted in this diagram in these red points in the brain, in contrast to empathy, which is depicted by the blue points. And the exciting work on compassion is that psychologists have shown compassion can be induced under certain conditions. People can learn, can become unskilled, can acquire, can heighten their capacity for compassion. And I think that shows tremendous promise in our field in conflict resolution. And I'm trying to document this with a current research study in which we are interviewing 15 students who are enrolled in a conflict resolution program in a village in Italy called Rondine. And these students basically are going through their training, and we're trying to see if it enhances their compassion. So this is a data gathering, data analysis process. Hopefully it would. I think the administrators would be shocked if the program reduced their compassion, but we need to get the data on that. That's a summary of the book. So thank you very much.
I'm happy to talk about this very interesting book. I'll be short because I'm sure you've got questions of your own and comments that you would want to make. I want to start by welcoming the Conflict 600 class here, who are here en masse, and not because I told them to come either, because they know there's no attendance being taken, because they're interested. They've been interested in this field all semester long, and they still are. I tell them, and sometimes in my other students, that the key to doing creative work in our field is asking the right questions, or more broadly, focusing on the right topics. What kind of topic? Well, Dan has always had the ability to spot topics that are essential to our field, that are going to be useful in practice, but that are under-recognized and under-theorized, and capable of shedding new light on practical problems, especially if the insights of various fields can be brought to bear on the question. So Dan is a philosopher, started as a philosopher of science, became a social psychologist, a peace theorist, a political analyst, an ethicist, and even now a neuroscience popularizer. This, I think, it illustrates the fact that we're not just multidisciplinary around here. We are intellectual Vikings, raiding other fields at will for answers to questions that we think are germane and that haven't been answered. And these questions, we understand, are of immediately relevance to the business of resolving conflicts and healing fractured relationships. In this case, Dan's topic, as he just told you, is humiliation as a cause of conflict and an indicator of also possible means of resolution. Or, as he puts it, in a nutshell, he says in his introduction, there's a focus here on government-sponsored practices of strategic manipulation designed to manufacture notions of the inferiority of a population group. He also talks, as he just did, about systemic humiliation, has some other fine phrases to summarize this. And I have to say that as I read the book, it brought back some memories of my own. Even though I'm not a member of a particularly persecuted or outcast group in the United States, at least not anymore, that didn't prevent me from being called a Christ killer in grade school by people who otherwise were my friends. It didn't prevent me in the 7th grade from being assigned a civics text by a very intelligent civics teacher, which said, this text said that the people who had immigrated to the United States at the turn of the century, or between 1880 and 1920, did not make good Americans because they were so hard to assimilate, and their traditions were not the same as the traditions of the Northern Europeans who had created the colonies. I took that book home. I realized, of course, they were talking about me, my grandparents, and I took the book home, and my parents eventually got it thrown out of the school. But I don't know how many generations of kids who were taught that the immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe weren't good Americans, like the immigrants from Northern Europe. And then, of course, in high school, I remember very clearly being shown by an otherwise, I'm sure, decent person, teacher, a movie called The Birth of the Nation, which, if you haven't seen it, you better. It's one of the pioneering films, Hollywood's pioneering films. The heroes of the movie are the Ku Klux Klan. It tells the story of Reconstruction from a white supremacist point of view and shows why those poor black folks just weren't ready to rule themselves after the Civil War, and therefore the South had to be saved from them by the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. So to illuminate humiliation of this kind and a lot worse, Dan looks at systems or fields of power, government policy, social psychological discoveries, even brain research, applying insights from those fields to cases that he mentioned already that involve the treatment of immigrants and self-deportation, the erasure of African Americans in the criminal justice system, and the use of symbolic violence in the Sudanese Civil War. Some of the more interesting points, at least points that to me were interesting, and I'm sure you'll find your own when you read this book, he makes a crucial distinction between humiliation, which is a degrading treatment of which people are conscious, and which he points out generates indignation and can generate various forms of resistance, and shame, in which dominated groups internalize their humiliation and accept it. And as we know, that can happen for a long time. Before the Black Power movement in the United States, it happened for hundreds of years. At the end, he offers a possible strategy for resolving conflicts generated by humiliation, the cultivation of compassion. Well, the best books, I think, are those that leave you hungry for more, that make you ask questions, make you think and ask questions. This book raises fascinating questions that make you want to ask more. One of them, for example, I'll give you a couple of examples. What's the process by which shame becomes humiliation? And vice versa, because Dan points out you can start out with humiliation in which people are indignant and fighting back, and sometimes have that turn into shame, in which they give up the struggle. They're forced to accept the struggle. But I was fascinated to ask myself, well, so what conditions operate to produce those results, the conversion of, in particular, the conversion of shame into humiliation? That's like the question of when people become conscious of human needs and decide that they're being screwed, or when people become conscious of other forms of oppression. Second, to what extent are the humiliating policies and actions that are described in the book deliberately produced by governments? And to what extent are the governments themselves caught up in the fields that generate these policies? Sometimes Dan talks about the mind snatchers in the book, about governments, and there are certainly cases in the case studies in which governments seem to know what they're doing and then deliberately foment these policies. In other cases, it may be something less conscious and also more chaotic in a way. Third question: what's the relationship between the public policies, such as those described in the book, and other systems, socioeconomic systems or cultural systems, that empower economic, political, and cultural elites. Dan focuses on fields, what he calls fields of governmentality, which is a useful thing to do, for sure. But it also made me think that if you go beyond governmentality, if you go beyond even the distinction between high power and low power groups, maybe you find out some more about the relationship between, in a way, the inside and the outside factors. I mean, one of the things Dan does so well in this book, and that's something that the whole field is trying to do, but most of us don't do it as well as he does, is to try to put together descriptions of socioeconomic and political systems with psychological systems, to try to get a picture of conflict as being generated by subjective and factors, and I don't want to quite say objective, but I will. Subjective and less subjective factors, so that we know what's going on in people's heads, but we also know what's going on in the social context taken as a whole that's somehow relating to what's going on in their heads. So the whole thing made me think of, when he was talking about the high power and low power groups in particular, the problem that if you talk about immigrants and anti-immigrant sentiment, for example, now in the United States, or if you talk about racism and the kind of police misconduct that he mentions that he analyzes in the book, you're talking about a situation in which the class situation is complicated, and it appears as though a sector of the working class is being used against another sector of the working class. It appears as though the real audience for these strategies of humiliation are people who already are so socially insecure and precarious, economically precarious themselves, that they are fodder for this kind of racist and anti-immigrant and in some cases anti-worker brainwashing. And so anyway, it's interesting to think of these operations that Dan describes in the book taking place within a society where there are serious class divisions, and they're not just two classes, and to see how the system operates to keep relatively deprived people at each other's throats. And finally, he raises the question when he talks about compassion: how can these systems be changed to make room for or to engender the sort of compassion that the book recommends as a possible solution? Because I think he's absolutely right that compassion is a wonderful new field of study, and it holds out great promise for people in the peacemaking and peace-building business. But at the same time, it's necessary probably to deal with the whole problem of systemic change. And so that's another challenge for him and for us. I could see another 2 or 3 books coming out of this without any problem at all. What he's done is by recognizing the importance of humiliation and the way people resist being humiliated, he's helping to establish a major new theme for us, for our research and practice, for which we're very, very grateful. Thank you for the wonderful book.
I am so grateful for Rich's comments, and fortunately the dean is here, so I can request another study leave for that. And there's a lot of pressure, Kevin, a lot of pressure now, so please, questions, comments, anything, corrections that I need to, maybe it's too late. Yes. Professor Susan Allen.
Thank you very much. Dan, this was fabulous to hear your overview of the whole book, and I can't wait to read the whole thing and have more detailed engagement with it. You mentioned looking for a term to capture this psychological humiliation, this political humiliation, and I just wondered about psychopolitical humiliation.
Oh, well, that sounds good.
If that captures, yeah.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I think we are so stuck, like habitually, into thinking of the mind and then there's power. And this is, as you say, you know, psychopolitical humiliation is a little bit kind of clunky, but we, you know, a lot of times our language limits us to recognize fields and to envision other ways of thinking. So I'm hoping to come up with a term. Yes, Chip House.
So Dan, I was, not surprisingly for you, drawn immediately to the idea of compassion and training it, especially after what Rich said, in that in dealing with this kind of humiliation, there is going to be precise, a shitload of anger come out. But if you read, for example, Arthur Brooks of AEI and the Dalai Lama had an op-ed in the Post about a month ago, and Arthur has a book about compassion and how you train it. And at the very least, you change your own brain in the ways you were talking about. So I guess I have two questions, and I can't answer either of them. So the first is, how do you balance the need of people to say screw you to the oppression with compassion? And second, how do you train people in the compassion that His Holiness, for example, asks people to do, and do it in a way that takes it to scale?
Yeah. So this is a great question about how we judge rebellion or activism or something. And this is as much an ethical question as a political, as well as a conflict resolution. How do we judge the reaction of oppressed people? I mean, this is a huge question of Ted Gurr, why men rebel. You know, Ted Gurr's framing about relative deprivation, he doesn't talk about the psychology, but it's very deeply psychologistic without him really using those terms. And so I'm going to rephrase your question. How do we judge people who are violent, who are physically use physical violence for rebellion? My sense is our field is extremely tolerant of that. And I can cite references to riots among African Americans and what people in our field say about that, as you know, but I think it's a complexity. I don't think we've done really clear enough job at judging rebellion and actually making moral judgments that some rebellion is totally unwarranted and others are warranted. That is, to make that distinction that some rebellion is not warranted and some is. That's as much a moral judgment. And I think that is necessary. So, and which is related to the pacifist position of the Dalai Lama.
Hi, that was a great presentation. Thank you. My name's Asra Nomani, and I was just, I got an invitation to come here and I was really excited by this. So I'm a journalist, and my area of research is a lot of terrorism issues, and I think one of, to your point, and to, yes, and to the idea of what do we call this, one term that I've heard of in talking about people who go into terrorism that have had grievances and humiliation against them is this term of them as wound collectors, because they collect the wounds. And then to this point about rebellion, the terrorism becomes, so I'll put it in quote marks for this discussion, the terrorism becomes their own rebellion. And the tricky thing to me is that if we have automatic compassion or work for compassion for all circumstances of grievances, we end up in a tricky situation.
You need to rationalize
Violence? You mean to be
it can-
compassionate to the person who is violent?
Yeah, which
Absolutely.
is, right, which is sort of where you were going, I think, with what you were saying in terms of how to negotiate the rebellion.
There's no question. I mean, the cycles of violence in the Great Lake District, cycles of violence, this is just so typical of the Tutsis and Hutus, obviously, for decades and decades, that, and now the situation is quite fraught. It's certainly not stable. So this is an interesting, should we be compassionate to people who rebel and commit violence? That is an ethical question. But let me just mention also Richard Rubenstein's point and really important question about the shift from humiliation to shame and back again. So this is a really, I didn't really delve as deeply as I should have, I think, into that process of transition. And this sometimes is basically the space for autobiography and for, I think, writers of fiction like James Baldwin, like Ta-Nehisi Coates, like, and also activist Martin Luther King. They often will blend that sense of deeply wounded shame with the need for, as obviously, rebellion, for obviously kind of almost purification. That sense of rebellion is a project, is a vision, is something that is a continual struggle, which is obviously in the writing, obvious in James Baldwin. He was continually struggling to confront the racist of his past. And he often cited the childhood experiences of being brutalized by police officers in Harlem. So is it shame or humiliation? Oftentimes it kind of is an evolving process that maybe takes time. And this was obviously a major theme of Malcolm X, is to remove the poison that was ingested of white supremacy. So he was basically imploring African Americans to overcome their shame, but to recognize the poison that they have ingested. And that was his term.
Right, and then he went another step. He went from rebelling against the whites to rebelling against the system.
Against
The whole system.
the whole, that's right. The whole system, that's right. As did, of course, Martin Luther King later in his life. Okay, question, any other question? Yes.
Dr. Rothbart, could you comment on whether the census could be a mechanism of state domination, or whether you think there are other mechanisms that can sort of lead to the state having that position?
Yeah, you know, when you have a thought in your mind, you see it all over the place. Do you ever have that experience? So the issue of the question on the census is like, it seems to me definitely an attempt of targeting and erasure. It's definitely erasure, because I mean it is strategic practice that is part of. You know, Galtung obviously is one of our great leading figures in our field who inspires us. I would just have a minor correction of his distinction between structural violence and cultural violence, that which he called, you know, the symbols of the structural violent state, symbols of inequality. So here you have a case, excellent question, of a practice that is obviously symbolic, and yet it is absolutely a form of basically segmenting and identifying and making invisible a large segment of the population. So, yeah. Professor Mitchell.
What does your book say about, what do you say about, what does the field say about the humiliator? Why?
Why?
What do they get?
that
Somebody who humiliates, the other side of the equation.
oh, the humiliator.
What does neuroscience say about humiliation from the humiliator's point of view?
From the humiliator standpoint. I'm not sure about the neuroscience per se, but the social psychologists have said that the humiliator obviously there's many sources for the humiliator to do this, obviously, many motivating factors. One of which obviously is to deflect attention. I mean, the notion of scapegoating has been around obviously for a long time. But it also is social psychologists have basically had a kind of insidious form of self-elevation. In the process of humiliating, the humiliator is basically self-elevating. And that has been documented by a number of social psychologists. It'd be interesting what the neuropsychologists have said, I don't know, and actually doing fMRI studies. But the social psychologists, many of which have said, and that I think that is a major theme of systemic humiliation, is this kind of this manufactured, collective narcissism of our own purity. Because any time I hear this group is illegal, impure, or whatever, it is a form of manufactured self-elevation, which also intersects with Pierre Bourdieu's theme of symbolic violence. So, yes, did you want to follow on that?
Yeah. There's a kind of circularity about this, which is, somebody who humiliates somebody else in a supermarket or something like that has often been humiliated themselves by other people, and are actually, taking out their own sense of lack of worth on somebody that they see as a target. So the whole thing seems to be a sort of circular problem.
Well, I don't know if it's a circular, but it's a sort of it kind of it's my image here is not circular. It kind of is a force that feeds through different groups. It's kind of a psychic political force. And a perfect example of that is poor whites in the South. So poor whites in the South during the Jim Crow period, one very well-documented theme by historians of the South is how poor whites basically were oppressed economically, the class issue that Richard Rubenstein mentioned. And yet the upper class whites were able to basically degrade, of course, deflect the oppression, the class distinction, deflect that, and basically focus on, obviously, racial categories. So here you had the poor whites, the classic, To Kill a Mockingbird type, so many stories about that. So social psychologists and social identity theorists have actually shown a pattern of this kind of, not circular, but I think it is kind of sequential, that is, as victims become agents and so on. I think that happens. That is very well documented in many, many contexts. So that's a case where, again, very often victims become agents, which is kind of a Foucault theme also. Foucault doesn't deal with psychology of any depth at all, but I think it fits into his kind of sociological perspective. Yes, Sandra Tombe, thank you for your assistance.
Thank you for this great presentation. I'm interested to hear what you think about how this book could be used. You talked about how it's a short book, so I'm thinking about ways of incorporating it in the classroom. So what do you envision it as something that could be used, and how could it be used?
I did not ask her to say this, but do you think a lot of my students should use this book? Well, okay, so one of the problems with a book that crosses over different fields is that classrooms tend to be in one subject or the other subject, And publishers say, well, which class is this going to go for? So my short answer is many conflict analysis classes, many conflict resolution classes, because our field is so fundamentally interdisciplinary, obviously. So identity-based classes, classes about state power, classes about structural, if there's a class on structural, we should have a class on Galtung and his commentators, Galtung and his admirers and critics, or something like that. Those kind of classes in our field. But it's written for kind of upper level undergraduate level, but it could be appropriate. Thank you for coming. It would be appropriate for that, for those. So thank you for that. And I try to get it as low price as possible. Yes, yes.
So when you were going over some of the neuroscience research, and what struck me is how real this is for those who experience it. But my question is, for those of us who are not experiencing, who are not having this experience, people who are outside, how can we recognize shame from the outside, since we're not experiencing the same amount of physical pain as someone who is experiencing?
You mean in other people?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting question. That's a really tough question. So that's my way of avoiding a direct answer, because I don't have a short answer for that. The challenge on that question, like how do you know people are experiencing humiliation, is that it can be felt for years. And we all know, I mean, it's kind of intersects with the field of trauma. Trauma can be exhibited in many different patterns, behavioral patterns. I just want to emphasize, I'm surprised that people in studying trauma don't talk about systemic trauma, that is or manufactured trauma. So that obviously is the direction I would suggest. That is the fact that the trauma producing mechanism is normative. It becomes something that is part of a normal practice, like the census question that was asked a few minutes ago. I mean, that's not trauma, but that's a form of erasure which then becomes normalized. So I don't have a really good answer to that, because the behavioral indicators could be long-term. It could come in many different ways. It could come out years later. It could come out in violence, as in trauma. It could come out in many different ways. So, yeah. Wouldn't it be great if you put everybody under a fMRI study and basically focus on the brain at the time? I'm in it with a group with the Alliance for Peace Building that has been talking about this, and we have not done it yet, but that's the direction. Yes, Joel.
Yes,
and
okay.
Igbo.
Yeah, well, just a scenario. When you start looking at, for example, rape as a weapon of war, or starvation as a weapon of war, one would argue that it's actually perhaps public humiliation.
Yes.
That groups use against each other, for
Absolutely.
example.
Rape definitely
Yeah,
has
but
been shown.
the aim necessarily is not to humiliate them. The aim might be actually to gain a political advantage.
Yes.
And so while they're doing that, and then you start talking about compassion, for example. So in terms of like CVE or counterterrorism, one talks about counter narratives. But the narrative sometimes is a narrative of compassion. How do you blend all those together? Where you're talking about compassion as an idea to actually counter humiliation, but then it's already been done in some of the narratives or counter narratives of terrorism or counterterrorism.
The compassion is being done? I'm not sure.
Well, also the compassion is part of the narratives, right? So
But
some argue that the counter narratives that they're doing to counter terrorism or counter violence, it's a narrative of compassion.
Okay.
And so how do you reconcile that? Well, on one side, what government or people are actually trying to do, it's not to humiliate people, it's actually to achieve a political goal.
Okay.
But they're just using humiliation as a path to get there. So in terms of when you're doing the counter narratives or you're bringing in the compassion, that's actually not what they're trying to do.
Okay.
The match here is not necessarily to get to humiliate people, but to actually get something out of it. I don't know if it makes sense.
Oh, so the governments are trying to basically exploit a vulnerable population group,
yes,
and they rationalize it as compassion, or?
Well, we see the act as humiliation.
Okay.
But then the goal is actually to achieve something else than humiliation.
Okay. Okay.
And so if the solution to that is to bring in compassion,
yeah,
how that really?
So this doesn't. This whole project doesn't in any way rule out other political factors or other motivations that could also be relevant. So this is not basically to eliminate other frames of understanding conflict, some of which obviously are political, self-serving, and so on. So thank you for that. Any other question? So thank you very much for coming and asking good, hard questions. And I do need another study leave to address some of the questions. Dean Averick, your time is clicking, huh? So yes, do you have one more?
Just quick.
Okay.
When will your book be available?
It's available now, and these people, you're so kind. This is why I love being here. People are so kind. So thank you very much, and I will work on another thing.